He thought he was buying a ring for his future, but the moment he looked up, he came face to face with the woman who had never truly left his past. Ethan Kong stepped out of the black sedan and stared at the towering glass storefront of Bellamy and Company, jewelers on Fifth Avenue. The late afternoon sun reflected across polished windows, casting gold across the sidewalk and the steady stream of well-dressed shoppers moving through Manhattan. Inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit rested a folded note containing the exact specifications his family expected him to follow. Platinum, 3-carat diamond, flawless, elegant, appropriate for the woman he was supposed to marry, appropriate for the future everyone had chosen for him. Ethan adjusted his cuff and entered the store. The soft chime above the door echoed through the showroom. Crystal displays sparkled beneath warm lighting. Diamonds flashed like tiny stars beneath glass cases. Everything looked perfect, controlled, predictable, just the way his life had become. A young associate greeted him immediately, recognizing him before he even spoke. People always did. His name carried influence, respect, expectations. "Mr. Kong, welcome back," she said politely. "Someone will assist you right away." Ethan nodded and slipped his hands into his pockets. He felt strangely detached, as if he were watching another man walk through the motions of a life that no longer belonged to him. Across the showroom, another employee stood behind a display counter arranging engagement rings. Her back was turned toward him. Dark curls rested neatly against her shoulders. For a brief second, something about the silhouette tugged at a memory he had spent years trying to bury. Impossible, he thought. New York was too large. 10 years was too long. Life did not hand out second chances like scenes from old movies. The woman turned around. Time stopped. The noise of the city vanished. The conversations around him faded into silence. Ethan forgot how to breathe. Maya Carter stood less than 20 feet away holding a velvet tray in her hands. The same deep brown eyes. The same quiet dignity. The same face he had carried in the hidden corners of his mind every single day for a decade. She froze too. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. The tray trembled almost imperceptibly in her hands before she steadied it. Ethan felt his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. 10 years disappeared in an instant. He remembered summer evenings in Brooklyn. Cheap takeout containers. Dreams too big for their circumstances. Promises whispered beneath city lights. Then he remembered the letter. The goodbye. The silence that followed. Maya was the first to recover. Professionalism settled over her features like armor. She crossed the showroom floor with measured steps until she stood before him. "Good afternoon, sir," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried storms she refused to reveal. "I understand you're shopping for an engagement ring today." Ethan stared at her. Of all the things he had imagined hearing if he ever saw her again, those words had never been among them. Maya offered a polite smile and opened the velvet tray between them. Rows of brilliant diamonds reflected in the light. "Congratulations on your engagement," she said. And somehow those 4 simple words hurt more than anything else she could have said. He thought he was buying a ring for his future, but fate had placed his past behind the counter. Ethan Romano's fingers tightened around the velvet ring box in his coat pocket as he stepped through the revolving doors of Crown and Pierce Jewelers, the most exclusive jewelry store in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, casting warm reflections across polished marble floors. The scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air, blending with the quiet hum of soft piano music. Everything about the showroom was designed to celebrate love, commitment, and new beginnings. Yet none of those things occupied Ethan's mind. At 38 years old, Ethan had built a life most people could only imagine. His tailored charcoal overcoat fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. His watch cost more than the average family's annual income. The black SUV waiting outside carried enough security features to transport a head of state. Success followed him everywhere. Respect followed him everywhere. But happiness was another matter entirely. 3 weeks from now, he was supposed to announce his engagement to Victoria Hayes, the daughter of a powerful business family. On paper, it made perfect sense. She was elegant, intelligent, respected, and everything a man in Ethan's position should want. Their families approved. Their friends approved. Even the media seemed eager for the announcement. The engagement ring was simply the final step. The final detail before the future became permanent. A smiling manager immediately approached him. Mr. Romano, welcome back. The diamond collection you requested has arrived. We prepared a private viewing room for you. Ethan offered a polite nod. Thank you. The manager gestured toward a hallway lined with glass display cases. One of our senior consultants will assist you today. Ethan followed without much thought. Outside, gray clouds covered the Chicago skyline, threatening rain. Inside, everything sparkled. Every diamond reflected light. Every polished surface looked flawless. Yet Ethan felt strangely detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. The manager stopped near a private consultation suite and smiled. I'll have her bring the collection immediately. Ethan glanced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. People hurried along the sidewalks below, carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Ordinary lives. Ordinary problems. For a brief moment, he envied them. Then he heard footsteps approaching. Soft. Measured. Professional. The manager turned. Naomi, our VIP client, is ready. Ethan barely looked up at first. His attention remained fixed on the city outside. But then a familiar voice answered. Of course. Everything inside him froze. The sound hit him before the sight did. 8 years disappeared in a single heartbeat. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Ethan turned around. A woman stood near the doorway holding a black leather presentation case against her chest. Her dark curls were neatly pinned back. Her Navy consultant uniform was immaculate. A silver name tag rested above her heart. Naomi Carter. The room seemed to lose all sound. The piano music faded. The conversations beyond the glass walls vanished. Ethan stared at her as if he had seen a ghost. Naomi's eyes widened for only a fraction of a second before her expression returned to perfect professionalism. But he saw it. The shock. The recognition. The pain she tried to hide. 8 years. 8 years without a phone call. Without an explanation. Without goodbye. And now she stood less than 10 feet away, preparing to sell him an engagement ring. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Naomi opened the presentation case with steady hands despite the storm gathering behind her eyes. Good afternoon, Mr. Romano, she said softly. I'll be helping you choose the perfect ring today. And in that moment, Ethan realized she wasn't supposed to be here. For several long seconds, Ethan could not bring himself to look at the diamonds. Every stone on the velvet tray seemed insignificant compared to the woman standing across from him. Maya lowered her eyes first and carefully placed the tray on the glass counter. The movement was graceful, controlled, practiced. She had learned how to hide her emotions. Ethan could see that much. 10 years ago, Maya had never hidden what she felt. Her smile had arrived before her words. Her laughter had filled entire rooms. Back then, she had worked weekends at a neighborhood bookstore in Brooklyn while finishing college classes and chasing dreams that always seemed slightly bigger than their bank accounts. Ethan remembered rainy afternoons squeezed into a tiny coffee shop near Atlantic Avenue. He remembered sharing a single blueberry muffin because neither of them wanted to spend $8 on two. He remembered Maya spreading notebooks across the table, outlining plans for the future with complete confidence. She wanted a career. She wanted a family. She wanted a life built on honesty and kindness. More than anything, she wanted a life that belonged to her. And somehow, she had convinced Ethan he deserved the same thing. At 28, he had still believed he could walk away from the responsibilities waiting for him. He had believed love was stronger than expectations, stronger than family obligations, stronger than fear. Looking at her now, he realized how young they both had been. Maya adjusted one of the rings beneath the display lights. This collection has been very popular recently, she said politely. Many clients prefer classic settings. Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of the conversation. Many clients. Classic settings. As if they were strangers discussing jewelry instead of two people carrying an entire decade of unfinished history between them. You still live in New York? He asked quietly. Maya paused for only a fraction of a second. I do. Her answer was short. Professional. Safe. Ethan nodded. He deserved that distance. After all, the last thing she had given him was a letter. He could still remember the exact afternoon it arrived. The paper had been folded neatly. Her handwriting had been unmistakable. Every word had felt colder than the one before it. She had written that their future was impossible. She had written that she needed something different. Someone different. Then she was gone. No phone calls. No explanations. No second chances. For years, Ethan had carried that letter like a wound that never fully healed. He had told himself she had chosen another path. He had told himself she had stopped loving him. It was easier than admitting how much losing her had broken something inside him. "Sir," Maya's voice pulled him back to the present. "Were you interested in a round cut or an oval diamond?" Ethan looked up. Their eyes met again. This time, neither looked away immediately. Beneath her calm expression, he caught something he had not expected to see. Sadness. Not anger. Not resentment. Sadness. It vanished almost instantly, but it was enough. Enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about the day she disappeared from his life. Then a customer entered the showroom, and Maya stepped back behind the safety of her professional smile. "Take your time," she said softly. "Choosing the right ring is an important decision." Ethan stared at her as she walked toward another display. The strange feeling growing in his chest had nothing to do with engagement rings. For the first time in 10 years, he was no longer certain that the story he had believed was the truth. Naomi's fingers remained steady on the leather presentation case, but inside, her heart felt as though it had forgotten how to beat. 8 years. 8 years of unanswered questions stood on the other side of the polished table, wearing an expensive overcoat and a carefully controlled expression. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways during sleepless nights. Sometimes she pictured anger, sometimes relief, sometimes a conversation that finally explained everything. But she had never imagined it happening here, beneath crystal chandeliers, while helping him choose an engagement ring for another woman. "These are our most requested designs," she said softly, opening the case to reveal a collection of diamonds that sparkled beneath the showroom lights. Her voice sounded calm, professional, almost detached. Years of practice had taught her how to hide what hurt. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the rings, but he barely saw them. Every memory he had spent years trying to bury seemed determined to return all at once. He remembered a tiny coffee shop near the south side where Naomi used to study after work. He remembered rainy afternoons squeezed into a booth by the window, sharing fries because neither of them had much money. He remembered the way she laughed when he took life too seriously. Back then, he was not wealthy. He was not powerful. He was simply Ethan, a young man chasing opportunities and making promises he fully intended to keep. Naomi had believed in those promises. More than anyone, she had believed in him when there was very little reason to. The memory tightened something inside his chest. Across the table, Naomi carefully lifted a solitaire ring from its display cushion. "This one is one of our most popular selections," she explained. "The diamond is just over 2 carats with a platinum setting." Ethan nodded automatically. His attention drifted to her hands. He remembered those hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup on cold mornings. He remembered holding them while walking along Lake Michigan. He remembered the small silver bracelet he had saved for months to buy her on her 25th birthday. She no longer wore it. Of course she did not. 8 years was enough time for entire lives to change. Naomi returned the ring to its place and selected another. This design has become very popular for engagement announcements. The word engagement lingered between them. Neither acknowledged it. Neither needed to. Outside, rain finally began tapping against the enormous windows overlooking the city. The gray skyline blurred behind streams of water. For a brief second, Ethan felt transported back to another rainy day long ago. A day when Naomi had stood beneath a bus stop shelter, smiling despite the weather, telling him that people could survive almost anything as long as they had someone beside them. He had believed her then. The silence stretched. Professional. Controlled. Fragile. Finally, Naomi looked up and met his eyes directly for the first time since entering the room. There was no anger in her expression. No accusation. Somehow that hurt even more. "Have you seen anything you like so far, Mr. Romano?" she asked. Ethan stared at her for a long moment before answering. The rain continued falling against the glass. The diamonds continued sparkling beneath the lights. But the future he had walked in expecting suddenly felt much less certain than it had 1 hour earlier. Ethan left the jewelry store without buying a ring. The sales associate had politely offered to schedule a private appointment, but he barely heard her. Outside, Manhattan moved with its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis rolled through intersections. Business executives hurried along crowded sidewalks. Street vendors called out to passing tourists. Yet Ethan felt disconnected from all of it. His driver opened the sedan door, but Ethan remained standing on the curb, staring back at the store's elegant entrance. Maya was inside. 10 years ago, that simple fact would have filled him with happiness. Now it filled him with questions. During the drive uptown, he found himself looking out the tinted window while memories surfaced one after another. He remembered the small apartment Maya had rented near Prospect Heights, the radiator that rattled all winter, the second-hand couch they both pretended was comfortable, the framed quote she had hung above her desk that read, "Build a life you are proud to wake up to." Maya believed in simple things: hard work, loyalty, family. She had never cared about money or status. That was why the letter had never completely made sense. Even after all these years, part of him had struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the woman who supposedly walked away. The phone vibrating in his pocket interrupted his thoughts. His fiancée's name appeared on the screen. Victoria Sinclair. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before answering. Victoria's voice arrived bright and polished. She was exactly what everyone expected. Intelligent, sophisticated, connected to the right families. Their engagement would strengthen alliances and satisfy expectations on both sides. "Did you find the ring?" she asked. Ethan looked out the window. "Not yet." "You are impossible," she laughed lightly. "The gala is in 2 weeks. My mother keeps asking questions." Ethan forced a small smile she could not see. "I will handle it." After a few more minutes, the call ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Deep down, Ethan knew something uncomfortable. When Victoria spoke about their future, he felt respect, admiration, convenience. But he had never felt what he felt whenever Maya entered a room. Back at his penthouse overlooking Central Park, evenings settled across the skyline. The city lights flickered to life beyond towering windows. Ethan loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of sparkling water before walking into his private study. Shelves lined with books stretched across one wall. Awards and photographs occupied another. A lifetime of accomplishments surrounded him. Yet his attention landed on something hidden inside a drawer he rarely opened. Slowly, he pulled it out. A folded letter. The edges had softened with age. The paper carried the marks of being opened hundreds of times. Maya's goodbye letter. He stared at her handwriting and felt the familiar ache return. Then something unusual caught his attention. A detail he had somehow overlooked for 10 years. Near the bottom corner, faintly visible beneath one fold, was a small discoloration. Almost as if another page had once been attached. Ethan frowned. He unfolded the paper completely and examined it under the desk lamp. His pulse slowed, then quickened. The letter suddenly looked incomplete. And for the first time since seeing Maya again, a possibility entered his mind that he could not ignore. What if the story he had believed for a decade was missing an entire chapter? Naomi held his gaze for only a second before returning her attention to the display case. It was easier that way. Easier to focus on diamonds than memories. Easier to discuss carats and settings than the 8 years that sat silently between them. She carefully lifted another ring and placed it on the velvet tray. "This design became very popular last year," she said. "The center stone is surrounded by smaller diamonds that create additional brilliance." Ethan nodded, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He watched the practiced confidence in her movements, the calm professionalism, the quiet composure. It reminded him of something he had once loved about her. Naomi had always carried herself with a kind of grace that did not depend on money or status. Even when life was difficult, she moved through the world with dignity. Back then, she worked 2 jobs while attending evening classes. She rarely complained. She simply kept going. Looking at her now, he realized that part of her had never changed. "You seem to know a lot about jewelry," he said quietly. Naomi offered a small smile. "After 6 years, I would hope so." 6 years. The number caught his attention immediately. She had been working here for 6 years. Long enough to build a career. Long enough to become someone the store trusted with important clients. Long enough to create a life that did not include him. For reasons he could not explain, that realization left an unexpected ache in his chest. Naomi continued arranging the rings. "Do you have a particular style in mind?" she asked. "Classic, modern, vintage." Ethan looked down at the collection spread across the table. Every ring seemed beautiful. Every diamond reflected light perfectly. Yet none of them felt right. Not anymore. "I am not sure," he admitted. The answer surprised both of them. Ethan Romano was not known for uncertainty. He built businesses through decisive action. He solved problems quickly. He made difficult decisions every day. Yet somehow choosing a ring had become impossible. Naomi noticed the hesitation. "That is more common than you think," she said gently. "People often believe they are choosing a piece of jewelry. Most of the time they are choosing a future." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan looked at her. She seemed focused on the rings, but something in her expression suggested she understood exactly what she had said. Outside, the rain intensified. Water streamed down the tall windows overlooking the city. The gray afternoon light softened everything inside the showroom. For a moment, the world felt strangely distant. Then Naomi reached for a folder beside the display case. A simple movement. Nothing unusual. Yet as she opened it, a small photograph slipped free and drifted onto the polished table. Naomi's eyes widened instantly. She reached for it, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse. A young boy stood smiling beside a birthday cake. Maybe 7 years old. Dark curls. Bright eyes. The kind of smile that seemed impossible to fake. Naomi quickly retrieved the photograph and closed the folder. Her professional mask returned almost immediately, but Ethan noticed the change. The tension in her shoulders. The protective way she held the folder against her chest. Something important had just been revealed. Something she had not intended him to see. Ethan glanced toward the folder once more, then back to Naomi. And for the first time since entering the showroom, he realized there was far more to her life than the story he thought he understood. The next morning, Ethan canceled 3 meetings before sunrise. His assistant was too surprised to question him. In 15 years, he had built a reputation for discipline that bordered on legendary. He never postponed obligations. He never acted on impulse. Yet the folded letter remained on his desk, refusing to leave his thoughts. As pale morning lights spilled across the city, he carefully examined every inch of the paper again. The discoloration near the fold bothered him. It looked less like age and more like damage, as though something had been removed. Something important. By noon, Ethan found himself standing outside the Brooklyn apartment building where Maya had lived 10 years earlier. The neighborhood had changed. New cafes occupied old storefronts. Luxury condos stood where modest buildings once stood. Time had moved forward for everyone. Almost everyone. Ethan remained seated inside his vehicle for several minutes, staring through the windshield. Across town, Maya was finishing her shift at the jewelry store. She smiled at customers, answered questions, recommended settings and diamond cuts. To everyone else, she appeared calm, professional, unbothered. But the moment she returned to the employee break room, the mask slipped. She closed the door behind her and sat alone beside a small locker. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a bottle of water. 10 years. 10 years without seeing Ethan. 10 years spent convincing herself she had made peace with the past. Yet one look at him had reopened memories she thought had finally healed. She remembered the last day she saw him. The rain. The fear. The impossible choice placed before her. Most of all, she remembered writing a second letter. A letter she had poured her heart into after the first one. A letter that explained everything. She had mailed it the following morning, believing Ethan would read it. Believing he would understand why she disappeared. Believing he would know she never stopped loving him. Maya slowly closed her eyes. If Ethan had received that second letter, none of this would have happened. Meanwhile, Ethan entered the lobby of the old building and approached an elderly manager arranging packages behind a desk. The woman looked up and adjusted her glasses. At first, she did not recognize him. Then her expression changed. "Ethan?" she asked. He froze. "Mrs. Ramirez?" Her face softened immediately. "I have not seen you in years." Ethan smiled politely and exchanged a few pleasantries before asking the question that had brought him there. "Do you remember Maya Carter?" The older woman grew quiet. Very quiet. She looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "That young woman loved you very much." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Loved?" Mrs. Ramirez nodded slowly. "She cried for weeks after she left." Ethan stared at her. Nothing about that matched the story he had lived with for a decade. "She told me she had no choice," the woman continued. "I never understood what she meant." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Did she ever mention another letter?" Mrs. Ramirez frowned thoughtfully. Then her eyes widened. "Wait." She disappeared into a back office. Moments later, she returned holding a small cardboard box filled with forgotten records and paperwork. After several minutes of searching, she pulled out a yellowed envelope. Ethan immediately recognized Maya's handwriting. His breath caught. The envelope had never been opened. Naomi slipped the photograph back into the folder so quickly that most people would have missed it. Ethan was not most people. Years of paying attention to details had taught him when something mattered, and that photograph clearly mattered. Neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Naomi carefully adjusted the rings on the velvet tray and resumed her professional composure. "Would you like to compare the diamond cut side by side?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but Ethan noticed the faint tension behind it. The conversation had shifted. The room had shifted. Something invisible now stood between them. Ethan looked at the collection without really seeing it. His thoughts remained fixed on the smiling boy in the photograph. There had been warmth in that child's eyes. Familiarity. Something he could not quite explain. "Who was that?" he asked quietly. Naomi paused for half a second. Only half a second. Yet it was enough. "A family photo," she replied. Nothing more. Nothing less. The answer was simple, polite, and completely closed. Ethan recognized a boundary when he heard one. He nodded and let the subject drop, at least outwardly. The rain continued falling beyond the glass walls, turning the city into a watercolor of silver and gray. A notification vibrated on Ethan's phone. "Victoria." He glanced down at the screen. A message filled with wedding venues, guest lists, and excitement about their future together. He stared at the words longer than necessary before locking the screen again. Naomi noticed. She could not help noticing. The diamond ring consultation. The expensive watch. The message preview with Victoria's name. Every piece fit together easily enough. She had known this moment would eventually come someday. Ethan would move on. People always did. What she had not expected was how strange it would feel seeing it with her own eyes. "Your fiancé must be excited," Naomi said, returning her attention to the display case. Ethan hesitated. The word felt heavier than it should have. "I suppose so." Naomi offered a professional smile. "She is fortunate." Ethan almost laughed at the irony. 8 years ago, Naomi had been the one talking about future homes, future vacations, future children. She had once believed they would build those dreams together. Now she was congratulating another woman for receiving them instead. Silence settled once more. Then the store manager appeared outside the consultation room. "Naomi, when you are finished here, your evening appointment has arrived early." Naomi's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for Ethan to notice. "Thank you," she said. "I will be there shortly." The manager nodded and disappeared. Ethan checked the time. It was nearly 6 o'clock. Most employees would be preparing to leave. "You have another client?" he asked. Naomi carefully closed one of the display trays. "Another job." The answer surprised him. "Another job?" A small smile touched her face. Tired but genuine. Some things never change. Ethan remembered those words all too well. Naomi had always worked harder than anyone he knew. Yet seeing it now stirred an unexpected discomfort inside him. She had spent 6 years building a career here. Why would she still need a second job? Before he could ask, her phone lit up beside the folder. A message appeared across the screen. Naomi reacted too late to hide it. Ethan only caught a glimpse, but it was enough. The message read, "Mom's appointment went well. He is asking when you are coming home." And beneath the text was a small photo of the same smiling boy from the folder. This time, Ethan saw the caption underneath. "Happy 8th birthday, Mason." The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt. Ethan stared at Maya's handwriting while the world around him seemed to fade into the background. Mrs. Ramirez watched quietly as he turned the envelope over in his hands. The seal was intact, untouched, unopened. For 10 years, the answers he thought he already had been sitting inside a forgotten box only a few miles away. His fingers hesitated before finally breaking the seal. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age, but Maya's words were still clear. Ethan began reading. By the second paragraph, he could no longer feel the floor beneath him. Maya had never chosen another man. She had never stopped loving him. The letter described weeks of pressure from people connected to Ethan's family. Meetings she never wanted. Warnings she never expected. She wrote that powerful people had made it clear she would never be accepted into Ethan's world. More importantly, she wrote that she was afraid staying with him would destroy the future he had spent years building. Every sentence carried the same heartbreaking message. She had left because she believed it was the only way to protect the man she loved. Ethan continued reading until he reached the final page. His eyes stopped on one particular sentence. "I hope one day you learn the truth and forgive me for making the hardest decision of my life." He lowered the paper slowly. The room felt silent. Mrs. Ramirez pressed her hand gently against his arm. "I always wondered if you ever saw that letter," she said softly. Ethan could not answer. 10 years of anger suddenly had nowhere to go. 10 years of resentment collapsed beneath the weight of a few handwritten pages. That evening, long after the city lights appeared beyond the skyline, Ethan found himself parked across the street from the jewelry store. He had not planned to come, yet somehow he could not stay away. Through the large front windows, he spotted Maya preparing to close for the evening. The showroom was nearly empty. One by one, she secured display cases and organized paperwork behind the counter. Then something unexpected caught Ethan's attention. Near the register sat a framed photograph. He could not make out every detail from where he was parked, but he could see enough. A young girl smiled brightly at the camera, maybe 9 years old. Dark curls framed her face. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Something about the child felt strangely familiar. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. A feeling he could not explain settled into his chest. Maya noticed the photograph as she gathered her belongings. Her expression softened instantly. Not the polite smile she gave customers. Not the guarded expression she had shown him. This was different. Pure affection. Pure love. She touched the edge of the frame before slipping it carefully into her bag. Ethan remained motionless. The unanswered questions in his life had already doubled in less than 24 hours. Now another mystery stood before him. Who was the little girl in the photograph, and why did looking at her make his heart beat just a little faster? The message disappeared from the screen almost as quickly as it had appeared, but the words remained burned into Ethan's mind. "Happy 8th birthday, Mason. 8 years old." Ethan sat perfectly still while Naomi quietly turned her phone face down on the table. The gesture was small, almost automatic, yet it carried the weight of someone protecting a private world. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Somewhere beyond the consultation room, customers laughed and glasses clinked. Life continued as normal. Inside the room, however, something had changed. Naomi carefully closed the final display case and folded her hands together. "I apologize," she said. "I should have silenced my phone." Ethan shook his head. "It is fine." His voice sounded distant even to himself. 8 years old. The number echoed through his thoughts. He found himself calculating dates without meaning to, counting backward, revisiting years he had tried not to revisit. Naomi noticed the expression on his face and immediately understood what he was thinking. A shadow crossed her features before disappearing beneath professionalism. She had become very skilled at hiding emotions. Life had required that skill. "Mason is my nephew," she said gently before he could ask. "My sister's son." The explanation arrived naturally. Smoothly. Too smoothly. Ethan studied her face. Most people would have accepted the answer without hesitation. Yet something inside him refused to settle. Maybe it was the way she avoided eye contact afterward. Maybe it was the protective tone that entered her voice whenever the boy's name appeared. Or maybe it was simply the realization that he knew almost nothing about the woman sitting across from him anymore. 8 years had transformed her into a stranger carrying pieces of a story he had never been allowed to hear. Naomi stood and began gathering the trays. "Would you like me to prepare a few selections for private review?" she asked. Ethan looked at the diamonds once more. Earlier that afternoon, they had represented certainty, a future already chosen. Now they looked like expensive questions with no answers. "Not today," he said quietly. Naomi paused. "Of course." She carefully returned each ring to its place. Her movements remained graceful despite the exhaustion beginning to show beneath her eyes. For the first time, Ethan noticed the faint shadows there, the subtle signs of someone carrying responsibilities that never seemed to end. 2 jobs, family obligations, an aging mother, an 8-year-old boy waiting for her at home. The image stayed with him. As Naomi closed the final case, the manager reappeared at the doorway. "Naomi, your ride is here." Naomi nodded gratefully. "Thank you." She lifted the presentation case and prepared to leave. Then she hesitated. Just briefly, long enough to glance toward Ethan. Their eyes met across the polished table. 8 years of silence stood between them. 8 years of unanswered questions. "Congratulations on your engagement," she said softly. The words were polite, appropriate, exactly what a professional consultant should say. Yet Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Naomi offered a small smile and turned toward the door. He watched her walk away beneath the crystal lights until she disappeared beyond the hallway. The room suddenly felt much larger than before, much emptier. Ethan remained seated for several moments. Then he stood, slipped his phone into his pocket, and walked toward the window overlooking the rain-covered city. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about business. He was not thinking about success. He was not even thinking about the engagement. He was thinking about a woman who had somehow rebuilt an entire life without him, and a little boy named Mason whose smile refused to leave his mind. The following afternoon, Ethan returned to the jewelry store. This time he did not pretend he was there to shop. He arrived nearly an hour before closing and waited across the street until the flow of customers slowed. Through the windows, he watched Maya help an elderly couple choose an anniversary gift. He watched her patiently answer questions and smile with genuine warmth. There was something comforting about seeing her in ordinary moments. For years, he had remembered her through the lens of loss. Now he was seeing the life she had built without him. When the store finally emptied, Ethan crossed the street and entered. The familiar chime echoed softly through the showroom. Maya looked up from behind the counter. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across her face before professionalism returned. "Good evening," she said quietly. Ethan stopped a few feet away. This time he did not look at the display cases. He did not look at the diamonds. He looked only at her. "I found the letter," he said. The words seemed to steal the air from the room. Maya froze completely. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then she slowly set down the paperwork she had been organizing. "What letter?" she asked, though her expression already revealed the answer. Ethan carefully removed the yellowed envelope from inside his jacket. Maya stared at it as though she had seen a ghost. Her eyes immediately filled with emotion. "That is impossible," she whispered. "I mailed it." Ethan nodded. "It never reached me." Maya looked away. Her shoulders sank slightly. 10 years of silence seemed to settle between them all over again. "I thought you read it," she admitted. "When you never called, I assumed you understood and hated me anyway." Ethan swallowed hard. "I never saw it until yesterday." Maya closed her eyes. For a moment she appeared exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. As though she had been carrying the weight of a misunderstanding for far too long. "Everything could have been different," she said softly. Ethan had no argument for that. Because she was right. Then his attention drifted toward the photograph resting beside her bag. Today it sat on the counter instead of hidden away. The smiling girl looked even more familiar up close. Ethan studied the image carefully. Maya noticed immediately. Her expression changed. Not fear. Not exactly. More like concern. A protective instinct. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. "Who is she?" he asked. Maya followed his gaze to the photograph. For several seconds, she said nothing. The silence itself felt significant. Finally, she picked up the frame and held it gently in her hands. The warmth in her expression returned instantly. "Her name is Ava," she said. Ethan stared at the picture. 9 years old. Maybe 10. Dark curls. Bright eyes. A smile that somehow felt painfully familiar. Then Maya looked directly at him. There was sadness in her eyes. And love. And years of untold truth. "Ethan," she said quietly. "There is something I should have told you a very long time ago." The city lights blurred across Ethan's windshield as his driver guided the SUV through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago. Normally, evenings were planned down to the minute. Meetings, calls, schedules, decisions. Tonight, none of those things seemed important. He sat in silence, staring out the window while the image of Naomi and the photograph refused to leave his thoughts. Across town, Naomi stepped off a city bus and pulled her coat tighter against the cold drizzle. The neighborhood was far from the polished luxury of the jewelry district. Small brick buildings lined the streets. Porch lights glowed warmly through the rain. She walked the final block carrying a grocery bag in one hand and her work tote in the other. By the time she reached the modest 2-story house, the front door had already opened. A boy burst onto the porch with a grin so wide it seemed to brighten the entire street. "Aunt Naomi," Mason shouted as he raced toward her. Naomi laughed and crouched just enough to catch him in a hug. "Slow down, birthday boy." Mason wrapped his arms around her neck. "You are late." "I know," she said. Work was busy. Through the open doorway, Naomi's older sister Danielle smiled from the kitchen. The smell of homemade macaroni and cheese drifted into the cool evening air. It was not a mansion. It was not glamorous. but it felt like home. Naomi stepped inside and immediately noticed her mother sitting comfortably in a recliner near the window. The older woman looked healthier than she had a year ago. The treatments were helping. Slowly. Expensively. But helping. Naomi felt a familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion. Every extra shift, every long day, every sacrifice, they all led back to moments like this. Family gathered under one roof. Safe. Together. Meanwhile, Ethan arrived at his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed breathtaking views of the city skyline. The apartment was elegant, quiet, and meticulously designed. Yet tonight the silence felt unusually heavy. His phone buzzed again. Victoria. He answered this time. Did you find the ring? She asked cheerfully. Ethan loosened his tie and walked toward the windows. Not yet. A brief pause followed. That does not sound like you. Victoria laughed softly. You usually make decisions faster than anyone I know. Ethan stared out at the ring. I guess I want to be certain. After the call ended, he poured a glass of water and sat alone in the dim light of his living room. His eyes drifted toward a storage cabinet he had not opened in years. For reasons he could not fully explain, he stood and walked toward it. The drawer slid open with surprising ease. Inside sat a small collection of forgotten items. Old photographs, ticket stubs, a faded birthday card, and beneath them all rested a worn envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Naomi's handwriting. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before carefully lifting it into his hands. Dust covered the corners. The envelope had never been opened. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened, because suddenly he could not remember putting it there, and he could not remember why he had never read it. A quiet silence settled over the showroom. The city outside continued moving, but inside the jewelry store time seemed to stand still. Ethan looked at Maya while her words echoed in his mind. There is something I should have told you a very long time ago. His eyes drifted back to the photograph, then back to Maya. Suddenly, every unanswered question from the last 24 hours seemed connected by an invisible thread. Maya took a slow breath and carefully placed the frame on the counter between them. Her hands remained resting on either side of it, as though drawing strength from its presence. Ava is my daughter, she said softly. Ethan nodded once. That much was obvious. Yet his heartbeat refused to slow. Maya lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. When I left 10 years ago, I was pregnant. The words landed with the force of a truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. Ethan froze. Every sound disappeared. Every thought scattered. For several seconds, he simply stared at her, unable to process what he had heard. Maya continued before fear could stop her. I found out only a few days before everything happened. I wanted to tell you. I tried to tell you. Her voice trembled slightly. The second letter explained everything. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He looked again at the photograph. The smile. The eyes. The familiar expression. Suddenly it all made sense. 1,000 small details aligned at once. Ava is. His voice failed him. Maya nodded slowly. Tears gathered in her eyes. Yes. Ethan pressed a hand against the glass display case beside him. Not because he felt weak, but because reality was rearranging itself around him. 10 years. 10 years believing he had lost the woman he loved. 10 years never knowing he had a daughter. 10 years that could never be returned. Maya looked away. I wanted to reach out so many times, she admitted. More times than I can count. But every year that passed made it harder. I convinced myself you had moved on. I convinced myself your life was better without all the complications I would bring back into it. Ethan shook his head slowly. You should have told me. The words were not angry. They were wounded. Maya nodded. I know. Another silence followed. This one filled with grief for everything neither of them had been allowed to have. Then Maya opened her phone and tapped the screen. She turned it toward him. Dozens of photographs appeared. Ava at a school science fair. Ava holding a soccer trophy. Ava smiling beside a birthday cake. Ava reading beneath a tree in Central Park. Ethan stared at each image. Every photograph felt like a missing piece of his own life. She loves astronomy, Maya said quietly, and mystery novels. She hates broccoli. She talks too much when she is nervous. And she laughs exactly the way you do. Ethan felt his eyes sting unexpectedly. Across the counter, Maya watched him carefully. Not with expectation. Not with pressure. Only with honesty. For the first time in 10 years, there were no secrets left between them. Only the truth. And the truth had changed everything. The envelope felt strangely heavy in Ethan's hands. He stood motionless beside the floor-to-ceiling windows while the city lights shimmered across the dark waters of Lake Michigan. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Naomi's. Careful, elegant, familiar. A part of him already knew this was not an ordinary letter. Slowly, he opened the seal. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. 8 years was a long time. His eyes moved across the first line, and the air seemed to leave the room. Ethan, if you are reading this, then somehow fate found a way to return my words to you. He lowered himself into a chair and continued reading. Naomi's voice seemed to come alive between the lines. She wrote about confusion, about waiting, about trying to understand why he had disappeared without explanation. She wrote about calling his number and receiving no answer, about visiting places they once shared and finding only silence. There was no anger in her words. That surprised him most. Instead, there was heartbreak mixed with hope. Hope that one day he would explain. Hope that whatever had happened had not been a choice. Ethan swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the final page. Then he froze. The date printed at the top caught his attention. The letter had been written nearly 8 years ago, only 3 weeks after their separation. He stared at the paper in disbelief. If Naomi had written this, why had he never received it? Why had it ended up sealed inside his own storage cabinet? His mind raced. Memories surfaced. Fragments of conversations. Old business associates. Advisors who had insisted certain relationships would become obstacles. People who had claimed Naomi wanted nothing more to do with him. At the time, he had been too overwhelmed by the rapid changes in his life to question everything. Tonight, for the first time, he did. Across the city, Naomi sat at the kitchen table, helping Mason assemble a small model airplane from his birthday gifts. The boy's face lit up every time a piece clicked into place. "Look," he said proudly. "I almost finished it." Naomi smiled. "You are getting faster every year." Mason grinned and returned to his project. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then Danielle entered the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. She sat across from Naomi and studied her sister carefully. "You saw him today, did you not?" Naomi's smile faded. There was no point pretending. Danielle had always been able to read her too easily. Naomi nodded. "Yes." Danielle sighed softly. "How did he look?" Naomi stared down at her tea. "Successful." The answer sounded smaller than she intended. Danielle reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "And how did you look at him?" Naomi did not answer immediately, because the truth frightened her. After 8 years, after all the pain, all the rebuilding, all the sacrifices, one look had been enough to remind her that some feelings never completely disappear. Back in his penthouse, Ethan folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then he picked up his phone. There was only one person left who might know how that letter had ended up hidden for nearly a decade. His thumb hovered over the contact name. The room fell silent. And for the first time, Ethan began to wonder if the story he had believed for 8 years had never been true at all. 3 days later, Ethan stood beneath crystal chandeliers inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotel ballrooms. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Business leaders, family friends, and influential figures moved between tables dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. At the center of it all stood a stage decorated with white roses and gold accents. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. The engagement announcement was supposed to be simple, elegant, predictable. Yet Ethan felt none of the certainty everyone expected from him. His hand rested inside his pocket, touching the small velvet ring box that had become a symbol of a future he no longer believed in. Across the room, Victoria greeted guests with practiced grace. She looked beautiful, confident, perfectly suited for the role everyone had assigned her. But when Ethan looked at her, he felt respect and friendship. Nothing more. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Maya sat beside Ava at their apartment kitchen table, helping her finish a science project about the solar system. Ava excitedly explained facts about distant planets while Maya smiled and listened. The ordinary scene felt priceless. Ethan had spent the past 3 days learning everything he could about the daughter he had never known existed. Every photograph, every school achievement, every story Maya had shared. And with every new detail, one truth became impossible to ignore. The life he wanted was not standing inside this ballroom. A microphone tapped softly against the speakers. Conversations quieted. Ethan's father approached the stage and welcomed everyone. Applause followed. Then came the introduction everyone had been waiting for. Ethan's name echoed through the room. Guests turned toward him expectantly. Victoria smiled. Cameras lifted. The moment had arrived. Ethan walked slowly toward the stage. The ballroom seemed unusually quiet. As he looked across the crowd, he saw faces filled with confidence. They believed they already knew what would happen next. They believed the evening had already been written. Ethan accepted the microphone. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he looked toward Victoria. She immediately noticed something different in his expression. Not uncertainty. Clarity. A calm honesty she had never seen before. Ethan took a slow breath. "Before tonight continues," he said, "there is something I need to say." The room grew still. Victoria deserves complete honesty. So does everyone here. Murmurs spread quietly among the guests. Ethan continued. "For a long time, I convinced myself that duty was the same thing as happiness. I convinced myself that fulfilling expectations would eventually feel right." Victoria's smile faded slightly. Ethan looked at her with genuine respect. "You are an extraordinary woman. Any man would be fortunate to share a future with you. But that man cannot be me." The silence that followed felt endless. No one moved. No one spoke. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed the velvet ring box. Then, instead of opening it, he placed it gently on the podium beside him. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Across the room, his father stared in disbelief. Yet Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time in a decade, he was no longer living someone else's story. He was finally choosing his own. The call connected on the third ring. Ethan stood beside the dark window overlooking the city while rain traced silver lines across the glass. "Ethan." The voice on the other end sounded older than he remembered. Richard Bennett had once been one of his most trusted advisors, a man who helped guide him through the chaotic years when everything in his life was changing. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said quietly. Silence followed. Then Richard sighed. It was the sound of a man already knowing what question was coming. "You saw Naomi again." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. "You knew?" Another pause. Longer this time. He could almost hear the weight of old regrets traveling across the line. "Richard." Ethan's voice dropped lower. "Tell me the truth." The older man exhaled slowly. "Back then, people around you believed you needed a clean future. They believed relationships from your past would complicate things. Some thought Naomi would hold you back. Others worried she would become a distraction." Ethan felt cold despite the warmth of the penthouse. "What does that have to do with the letter?" Richard remained silent for several seconds. Then finally he spoke. "The letter arrived." Ethan closed his eyes. The room seemed to tilt beneath him. "You intercepted it. I was told it was best for everyone." The words landed like stones. "Best for everyone?" Ethan repeated. "You let me believe she abandoned me. We also told her you wanted nothing to do with her." Ethan stared into the darkness beyond the glass. His pulse hammered in his ears. 8 years. 8 years stolen by assumptions, decisions, and people who thought they knew what was best. Richard's voice softened. "I have regretted it ever since." The call ended minutes later, but Ethan remained standing in the same place long after the screen went dark. Everything he believed had cracked apart. Naomi had not walked away. Naomi had not stopped caring. She had written. She had waited. And someone had made certain neither of them knew the truth. Across the city, Naomi sat alone on the back porch after everyone else had gone to bed. The rain had stopped. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stared toward the stars beginning to appear between the clouds. Her phone rested beside her. For a moment, she considered deleting Ethan's contact information from years ago. The number no longer worked. It had not worked for a long time. Yet she had never found the strength to remove it completely. Some memories became part of a person whether they wanted them or not. Inside the house, a floorboard creaked. A moment later, Mason appeared at the screen door rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Aunt Naomi?" he whispered. Naomi smiled immediately. "You should be asleep." Mason walked outside carrying a small stuffed bear and climbed onto the chair beside her. "Could not sleep." Naomi tucked the blanket around his shoulders. The boy leaned comfortably against her side. Together they sat beneath the clearing sky. Then Mason looked up and asked a question so innocent it nearly stopped her heart. "Do you think people can find each other again after being lost for a long time?" Naomi stared into the darkness. For a moment, she could not answer. Because somewhere across Chicago, a man was finally discovering that neither of them had ever truly let go. 6 weeks later, a cool Saturday afternoon settled over Central Park. Golden leaves drifted across walking paths while families gathered on blankets and children raced across open fields. Near a small pond surrounded by trees, Maya sat on a bench watching Ava feed pieces of bread to a group of ducks. The little girl laughed every time one waddled closer than expected. It was a simple moment. Ordinary. Peaceful. The kind of moment that often becomes unforgettable without warning. Over the previous weeks, Ethan had slowly become part of their lives. Not through grand gestures or expensive gifts. Through consistency. School pickups. Weekend lunches. Long conversations. Patient listening. He had spent years building powerful organizations and managing impossible responsibilities. Yet nothing had prepared him for helping a 10-year-old with science homework or learning the names of her favorite books. Ava had accepted him with a generosity that amazed him. Children, he discovered, often saw truth more clearly than adults. You smile more now, Ava had told him one afternoon. She had been right. Maya noticed it too. The walls Ethan had carried for years were finally disappearing. Across the park, Ethan approached carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate. Ava spotted him first and immediately waved. You got extra marshmallows? She called. Ethan laughed. I followed the official instructions exactly. Ava ran toward him and took her cup with excitement. Then she hurried back toward the pond, leaving Ethan and Maya standing alone for the first time that afternoon. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply watched their daughter laugh beneath the autumn sunlight. Their daughter. Even now the thought felt extraordinary. Maya turned toward him. She adores you. Ethan smiled softly. I am the lucky one. Silence settled comfortably between them. Not the painful silence of years ago. A different kind. The silence that comes when two people no longer need to hide from each other. Ethan reached into his coat pocket. Maya noticed the movement immediately. Her eyes widened slightly. He shook his head with a small smile. Relax. This is not what you think. Carefully, he removed a small velvet box. The same box that had once represented a future built on obligation rather than love. Maya stared at it quietly. Ethan looked down at the box before speaking. For years I thought this was supposed to solve everything. He opened it. The diamond ring inside sparkled beneath the afternoon light. Then, instead of offering it to her, he closed the box again and slipped it back into his pocket. Maya looked confused. Ethan stepped closer. His voice softened. Before anything else, there is something I need to do. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee. Not with a ring. Not with a proposal. Just honesty. Just humility. Maya's eyes immediately filled with tears. Ethan looked up at her. I am sorry, he said. For every year we lost. For every moment you carried everything alone. For every school play, every birthday, every memory I should have been there for. His voice trembled slightly. I cannot change the past. But if you allow me, I would like to spend the rest of my life making better choices than the ones that brought us here. Maya wiped away a tear and laughed softly through her emotion. Around them, the park continued exactly as before. No audience. No cameras. No dramatic spectacle. Just 3 people finding their way back to each other. Ava suddenly ran toward them, stopping a few feet away. Why is everybody crying? She asked. Ethan and Maya looked at each other and laughed. Then Ethan stood, wrapped one arm around Maya, and reached for Ava with the other. As the afternoon sun settled across the park, the future no longer felt like something waiting in the distance. It felt like home, and for the first time in 10 years, all 3 of them were finally walking toward it together. 3 days later, the ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and golden light. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Business leaders, family friends, and reporters mingled among towering floral arrangements and polished marble floors. Everything had been planned perfectly. Every detail reflected the future everyone expected Ethan Romano to choose. Yet as he stood near the center of the room, adjusting the cuff of his tailored black suit, nothing felt certain anymore. The ring box rested heavily in his pocket, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Across the room, Victoria greeted guests with effortless grace. She deserved honesty. She deserved respect. More than anyone, she deserved a man whose heart belonged completely to her. Ethan knew that now. He had spent the past 3 days reading Naomi's letter over and over again. He had uncovered the truth. The separation had never been Naomi's choice. It had never been his either. Two lives had been pushed apart by decisions made in silence. And now, standing beneath the lights, he faced a choice no one else could make for him. A server approached quietly. "Mr. Romano, there is someone asking to speak with you." Ethan turned. His breath caught instantly. Naomi stood near the entrance. She wore a simple navy dress and held a small envelope in her hands. She looked uncertain, as if she had nearly turned around several times before walking inside. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade. Guests continued talking. Glasses continued clinking. Yet Ethan noticed only her. Slowly, he crossed the room. Naomi's fingers tightened around the envelope. "I should not be here," she said softly. "Then why did you come?" Ethan asked. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "Because I spent 8 years believing you chose to leave. And after learning the truth, I realized neither of us deserved that ending." She handed him the envelope. Inside was a photograph. An old one. Two young people sitting beside Lake Michigan with paper coffee cups in their hands, smiling as though the future belonged entirely to them. Ethan stared at the image, then at Naomi. "I never stopped looking for answers," she whispered. "I just stopped believing I would find them." For a long moment, neither moved. Then another voice interrupted gently. "Ethan." They both turned. Victoria stood only a few feet away. There was sadness in her eyes, but also understanding. She glanced from Ethan to Naomi and offered a small smile. "I think I finally understand why you could never decide on the ring." The room fell quiet as nearby conversations began to slow. Victoria looked at Ethan kindly. "You were trying to choose a future while your heart was still living in the past." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Victoria shook her head softly. "You do not owe me an apology for being honest." Then she stepped back. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. With dignity. The kind that leaves a room silent. Ethan watched her walk away before turning back toward Naomi. The ring box remained in his pocket. Yet neither of them reached for it. Not yet. Some things deserved more than a grand gesture. They deserved time. Truth. A second chance earned honestly. Naomi's eyes filled with tears she did not hide this time. Ethan smiled for the first time in years without forcing it. Outside, the lights of Chicago reflected across the lake. Inside, two people stood together after nearly a decade apart. Not because fate had been kind, but because the truth had finally found its way home. And that night, everyone in the room witnessed something far more valuable than an engagement. They witnessed what dignity, forgiveness, and real love look like when given one more chance.